The first bell of the morning had already echoed through the long hallways of Jefferson High, but the building still carried that buzzing energy unique to a school settling into its rhythm. Lockers clanged open, chatter bounced off tiled walls, and the faint smell of cafeteria pancakes lingered in the air. Among the wave of students moving to class, Imani Lewis walked with her books hugged close to her chest, her head held high despite the stares she often attracted. At 16, she was a quiet but determined presence, someone who believed in keeping her composure no matter the circumstance. That morning should have been ordinary, but ordinary had a way of shattering without warning. Imani was on her way to homeroom when the unmistakable voice of Officer Brad Collins cut through the corridor. The school resource officer was already known for being heavy-handed, but few expected what he would do next. "Hey, you!" Collins barked, his boots striking hard against the linoleum floor as he closed the distance. His voice was sharp enough to still the air. Students turned, their conversations faltering. Imani froze, puzzled by his tone. "Yes, sir?" she asked softly. The officer's eyes narrowed as though her calmness irritated him further. "Don't sir me. What are you doing wandering the halls? Where's your pass?" His words came clipped, full of suspicion that had no place in a simple hallway interaction. Imani raised her notebook slightly, showing her schedule signed by her teacher. "I'm headed to class. The bell just rang." But Collins wasn't listening. His expression hardened into something more hostile, and his hand hovered near the radio clipped to his belt. The officer's posture screamed authority abused, as if he wanted the crowd gathering to know he was in charge. "You think you're special? Think the rules don't apply to you?" he demanded. His voice boomed down the hallway. Whispers rippled among the students, some uncomfortable, others wide-eyed with curiosity. Imani's chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay steady. "No, sir, I'm following the rules. My teacher excused me." Collins cut her off, his voice growing louder. "Don't you dare talk back. You people always have excuses, always think you're owed something." That last phrase, "you people," landed like a slap. Gasps escaped from a few students standing nearby. A group of teachers further down the hall looked up, their faces paling at the unmistakable venom in his tone. But Imani didn't flinch. Her mother had taught her that some battles were won not by shouting but by refusing to break. She lifted her chin and answered evenly, "I'm not asking for anything, I'm just trying to get to class." The hallway went silent. Collins's face darkened, his authority suddenly challenged not by aggression but by the quiet defiance of a teenager who refused to shrink. He stepped closer, so close that his badge gleamed inches from her face. "You think you can disrespect me and walk away?" His voice dropped low, dangerous. "Not in my school." Before Imani could answer, he grabbed the strap of her backpack and yanked it, forcing her off balance. Her books tumbled onto the floor with a thunderous crash that echoed through the hallway. Gasps erupted. Some students instinctively stepped back, while others craned forward to watch. The humiliation was complete, deliberate, and public. Collins stood tall, his voice ringing out for everyone to hear. "Maybe now you'll learn some respect." Imani bent slowly, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from rage she fought hard to contain. She gathered her books one by one, ignoring the murmurs, the cell phones quietly raised to record, the heat of humiliation burning her skin. She rose again, standing eye to eye with the officer. Her voice was soft, but carried across the hallway. "You can knock down my books," she said steadily, "but you won't knock down who I am." For a moment, the hallway froze. It was as if time itself paused at the sight of a 16-year-old girl refusing to bow to the uniform looming over her. Collins's jaw clenched, his pride wounded in front of an audience he had hoped to intimidate. And just then, the principal emerged from his office. Mr. Richard Lawson, tall and silver-haired, his brow furrowed as he hurried toward the scene. "Officer Collins, what is going on here?" Collins straightened immediately, his tone shifting but not his arrogance. This student was wandering the halls without permission, disrespectful, non-compliant. I was addressing it. Lawson turned to Imani, whose books were still clutched against her chest. His gaze flickered between her calm face and the murmuring crowd of students. Something in his eyes hinted that he recognized the gravity of what had just happened, though he hesitated. He knew Collins's reputation, but he also knew the politics of discipline in a school like this. "Imani," Lawson said carefully, "go to my office, now." Imani blinked. She wanted to protest, wanted to point out that she had done nothing wrong, but the weight of dozens of eyes held her in place. Slowly, she nodded and began walking toward the office, her steps steady despite the humiliation still clinging to her. The whispers followed her like shadows. "Did you hear what he said? She didn't even do anything. He just snapped her backpack." Phones buzzed with messages flying from one student to another. Imani entered the office and set her books down on a chair. Her heart still thudded in her chest, but her face remained composed. She refused to give Collins the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Lawson followed behind, shutting the door firmly. He spoke in a low voice meant only for her. "You'll sit here until we sort this out. Do you understand?" Imani didn't answer right away. Instead, she met his gaze, her voice calm but edged with quiet steel. "Do you understand what he just said to me, in front of everyone?" Lawson's eyes flickered. For a second, guilt tugged at his features. But before he could respond, the office door opened again and Collins stepped in, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. "This one needs to learn discipline," he said flatly. Imani sat straighter in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her silence was louder than any outburst could have been. She knew the truth. The students knew it. The teachers in the hall had heard it. And soon, someone else would know it too. Because while Officer Collins thought he had humiliated a student, he had no idea who that student was. He had no idea that the girl sitting silently in the principal's office was the daughter of Governor Anthony Lewis. And at that very moment, across town, the governor's phone buzzed with a message that would send him racing toward Jefferson High, unaware that his arrival was about to change everything. The principal's office was meant to feel like a safe place, dark wood shelves lined with old trophies, neat binders stacked in rows, the American flag standing in the corner. But in that moment, the air inside felt suffocating. Imani Lewis sat rigid in the chair across from the desk, her books balanced on her lap like a shield. She refused to bow her head, even as Officer Brad Collins loomed over her with a scowl that carried more arrogance than authority. Principal Richard Lawson rubbed his temples. He had been in education long enough to know when a situation was spiraling out of control, and this one had headlines written all over it. Still, he hesitated. The school board had pushed hard for a visible law enforcement presence after a string of incidents last year. Collins wasn't his choice, but Collins had influence in the police union, and Lawson couldn't just brush him aside. But Imani, she was different. She had always been one of Jefferson High's brightest students, excelling in honors classes, participating in debate club, volunteering at community events. Lawson knew her reputation. He also knew she carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that came from something deeper than grades or awards. "Let's slow down," Lawson said finally, his tone calm but strained. "Officer Collins, why don't you step outside a moment? I'll speak with the student." Collins bristled. "With all due respect, Principal Lawson, this is a disciplinary matter. She disrespected me in front of half the student body. If you let this slide, you're sending the wrong message." Imani spoke for the first time since entering the office. Her voice was steady, not raised, but it cut through the tension like glass. "I didn't disrespect you. You disrespected me." The silence that followed was heavy. Collins's face reddened, his hand twitching near his belt as though the presence of his badge gave him authority over every word spoken in that room. Lawson cleared his throat. "That's enough for now, officer. Please step outside." Reluctantly, Collins turned on his heel, muttering under his breath as he left the office. The door shut behind him with a sharp click. Lawson sank into his chair and folded his hands. He looked across the desk at Imani, who met his gaze without wavering. "Imani," he began carefully, You've been a model student here, but this situation is serious. He claims you were non-compliant and disrespectful." Imani leaned forward slightly, her voice controlled but firm. "Do you believe him?" Lawson hesitated. His silence was enough of an answer. Imani exhaled slowly, gripping her books tighter. "He grabbed my backpack. He knocked my books onto the floor in front of everyone. And then he said, 'You people always think you're owed something. Do you think that's discipline, or do you think that's something else?'" Lawson's mouth went dry. The weight of her words pressed heavily against him. He had heard stories, whispers about Collins being rougher with certain students than others. But hearing it said plainly by Imani, it left no room for comfort. Before he could respond, the office phone rang, its sharp ring slicing through the tension. Lawson picked it up. "Jefferson High, Principal Lawson speaking." A pause. His eyes flickered to Imani. "Yes, she's here. In my office now." His hand tightened around the receiver. "Governor Lewis? Sir? Yes, of course." When he set the phone down, his expression had changed. He leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken. Imani tilted her head, her eyes steady. "That was my father." Lawson nodded. "He's on his way. Now." Across town, Governor Anthony Lewis sat behind his mahogany desk in the state capitol, the morning sunlight streaming through tall windows. His day had been filled with meetings, economic briefings, legislative calls, policy drafts, but all of it vanished the second his phone lit up with the text from his daughter's friend. Something happened at school. Officer Collins grabbed Imani. Everyone saw it. Moments later, his phone rang again, Principal Lawson confirming she was in the office. Anthony Lewis was not just a governor. He was a father first, and when it came to his daughter, politics became irrelevant. His mind flashed back to the long nights he had spent guiding her through homework, the afternoons spent on debate practice, the way she carried herself with poise that reminded him of her late mother. He knew his daughter. He knew she would never cause a scene. If Collins had targeted her, it wasn't discipline. It was something darker. "Cancel my schedule," Governor Lewis told his aide, his voice firm but low. "Clear the motorcade. We're going to Jefferson High." The aide opened his mouth to protest. There were hearings scheduled, reporters waiting, but the look in Anthony's eyes silenced him. Within minutes, the governor's SUV was pulling away from the Capitol, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun as the convoy headed toward the suburbs. Back at the school, word was already spreading faster than wildfire. Students whispered in clusters near lockers. Teachers traded nervous glances. Social media lit up with clips from cell phone recordings. Officer Collins yanking Imani's backpack, books crashing to the floor, his sharp words echoing in the hallway. Hashtags with Imani's name began trending locally within minutes. The incident had already escaped the school walls before the first period ended. In the faculty lounge, Ms. Latoya Green, one of Imani's teachers, scrolled through her phone with disbelief. "They're going to regret this," she murmured. She had always admired Imani's grace and discipline. To see her treated this way was infuriating, but Latoya also knew something others didn't, who Imani's father was. "Oh, this is going to blow up," whispered another teacher. Latoya nodded. "Governor Lewis won't let this slide, not with his daughter." Meanwhile, inside the office, Collins had returned and was pacing like a caged animal. "She needs to be suspended," he demanded. "Students can't just talk back to officers. If she gets away with it, the whole school will think they can defy me." Lawson pinched the bridge of his nose. "Brad, you need to calm down. This isn't the time." But before he could finish, the sound of tires screeching into the parking lot interrupted him. The hum of idling engines followed several vehicles pulling up at once. Students near the windows gasped, rushing closer for a better look. Black SUVs lined the front of Jefferson High, their doors opening in unison. Out stepped men in dark suits, their earpieces glinting under the sun. And then, with the quiet confidence of a man who carried both authority and determination, Governor Anthony Lewis emerged. The whispers turned to shouts. "That's the governor! He's here for Imani!" Phones shot up again, capturing every second. Inside the office, Collins froze mid-sentence. Lawson's face drained of color. Imani sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, but her eyes carried the fire of quiet vindication. Governor Lewis was already walking toward the school doors, flanked by security. Each step carried weight, each second tightened the tension, and everyone inside knew the balance of power was about to shift. The front entrance of Jefferson High had never seen such a scene. Students pressed against the glass doors, their breath fogging the panes as they tried to capture photos and videos of the black SUVs lined across the curb. Teachers ushered them back with hurried whispers, but curiosity outweighed authority. The air shifted when Governor Anthony Lewis stepped into the building. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. Authority followed him like a shadow. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, his tie neatly knotted, he carried himself with the composure of a man used to commanding attention without raising his voice. Two members of his security detail flanked him, scanning the hall with practiced precision. The students fell silent as he passed, their whispers replaced by wide-eyed awe. For many, it was the first time they had seen the governor in person. For others, the realization struck hard. This wasn't just about a student anymore. This was about the daughter of the state's most powerful man. Governor Lewis's gaze never faltered as he strode down the hallway. He had already seen enough clips sent to his phone, frantic messages from staffers, screenshots of Officer Collins towering over his daughter. Every detail sharpened his resolve. When he reached the principal's office, he didn't wait for permission. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room froze. Imani Lewis sat quietly, her books stacked neatly on her lap. She lifted her head when her father entered, her eyes meeting his. For a fleeting second, her composure cracked and relief softened her face. But she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Principal Richard Lawson sprang to his feet. "Governor Lewis, sir, we didn't expect—" "You should have," Anthony interrupted, his voice calm but heavy with authority. He turned his attention to Officer Brad Collins, who straightened but couldn't hide the tension stiffening his posture. "So," Anthony said slowly, his eyes locking onto Collins, "you're the officer who thought humiliating a 16-year-old girl in front of an entire hallway was discipline." Collins' jaw tightened. "Governor, with respect, your daughter was being non-compliant. I was enforcing school policy." Anthony's eyes narrowed. Enforcing policy doesn't involve grabbing a child, knocking her books to the floor, and using language that strips her dignity. That isn't enforcement. That's abuse of authority. The silence in the room was suffocating. Lawson shifted uneasily, his fingers tightening around the edge of his desk. Collins, however, refused to back down. "I treat all students the same. If she felt singled out, that's her interpretation, but I don't play favorites." Imani's voice broke the silence. Calm even, but cutting through every excuse. "You didn't treat me the same. You said, 'You people always think you're owed something.'" The words hung in the air like a blade. Lawson closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing for the impact. Anthony leaned forward, his voice low and precise. "My daughter is not you people. She is a student, a citizen, and you will answer for every word and every action that humiliated her today." Collins shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the governor's stare pressing down on him. "I stand by what I did," he muttered, though his voice lacked its earlier force. Anthony turned sharply to Principal Lawson. "And you. You watched this unfold and chose to put her in this office instead of addressing the misconduct of your officer. Tell me, Principal Lawson, was that your way of keeping order, or was it fear of confronting someone in uniform?" Lawson swallowed hard. "Governor, please understand, I didn't want to escalate the situation further. I thought it best to keep Imani here until things calmed down." Anthony's expression hardened. "So the solution to a child being publicly humiliated was to isolate her? To make her feel like she was the problem? Do you realize what message that sends to her, to every student who saw it?" Lawson's face flushed, sweat beading along his hairline. He knew there was no defense that would stand against the governor's words. Meanwhile, outside the office, the hallway swelled with tension. Students pressed their ears against the doors. Teachers whispered nervously about what this meant for the school. And in the corner, Ms. Latoya Green stood quietly, her eyes filled with both anger and admiration. She had taught Imani for 2 years and knew her character better than most. To see her treated this way enraged her, but to see her endure it with composure reminded her why Imani was one of the strongest students she had ever taught. Inside, Anthony straightened his shoulders, addressing both men with the authority of his office. "This isn't just about my daughter. It's about the culture in this school. If an officer feels entitled to humiliate a student because of the color of her skin, then every parent in this district should be concerned." Collins shifted again, bristling. "Are you accusing me of racism, Governor?" Anthony's gaze never wavered. "I'm not accusing. I'm repeating the words you spoke yourself. You people. That's not policy. That's prejudice." Imani sat quietly, watching the exchange. Her heart swelled not because her father had arrived as the governor, but because he had arrived as the father who had always told her, "Never let anyone take away your dignity. Even when they try, stand taller." At that moment, the door opened again. Mr. Charles Whitaker, the school board representative, stepped in, his face pale from the phone calls he had already received. The incident had reached his office within minutes, and the pressure was already mounting. "Governor Lewis," he said quickly, "we're reviewing the situation. I assure you, the board takes this very seriously." Anthony turned to him. "Good. Because if you don't, I will. And I promise you, this state will not tolerate public institutions where children are degraded under the guise of discipline." Whitaker nodded rapidly, his words stumbling over themselves. Of course, we'll cooperate fully." Collins clenched his fists. "So now what? You're going to ruin my career because a teenager claims she was disrespected?" Anthony's tone dropped, steady and unyielding. "No, Officer Collins, you ruined your own career the moment you chose humiliation over humanity." The room fell silent again, and just outside the door, the murmur of students rose louder. They didn't know every word being spoken inside, but they knew one thing for certain. This day, their school would never be the same. The silence inside Principal Lawson's office lasted only a moment before the noise outside shattered it. The hallway had become a crowd, students pressing closer, voices rising in hushed waves. A few bold ones held up their phones, broadcasting live to social media. Clips of Imani's humiliation had already spread through the student body. Now the rumor that her father, the governor, was inside the school sent the frenzy into overdrive. The office door rattled slightly as the pressure of bodies pressed near. Principal Lawson glanced nervously toward it, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Governor Anthony Lewis, however, remained composed. He turned his attention from Officer Collins to his daughter. "Imani," he said gently, "do you want to tell me what happened in your own words?" Imani sat straighter, her hands folded neatly over her books. Her voice was calm, but each syllable landed with precision. "I was heading to class after the bell. Officer Collins stopped me in the hallway. I showed him my pass. He grabbed my backpack anyway, pulled it so hard I dropped my books. Then he told me, 'You people always think you're owed something.'" Her father's jaw tightened. Collins shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Lawson for backup. But Lawson's face remained pale, his silence an admission of what he had already heard from multiple witnesses. Anthony nodded once. "Thank you, Imani." Then his gaze swung back to the officer. "You humiliated a child in front of her peers. You weaponized your badge not for safety, but for intimidation. And then you used language that betrayed the very prejudice you were sworn to protect students against." Collins bristled, his pride stung. "Governor, with all due respect, the hallways have been out of control lately. I can't babysit hundreds of kids without enforcing discipline. If she—" "Stop," Anthony cut him off, his tone sharp but steady. "You don't enforce discipline by tearing down the dignity of a student, especially not my daughter." The last words hung heavy, not as a threat but as an undeniable fact. At that moment, the office door cracked open. Ms. Latoya Green, the teacher who had witnessed much of the scene, stepped inside. Her face was tight with concern, but her voice was steady. Governor Lewis, Principal Lawson, I think you need to come see what's happening outside. Lawson frowned. Outside where? The parking lot, Green answered. News crews are already here. The room froze. Collins swore under his breath. Lawson pressed a hand to his forehead, but Anthony Lewis simply stood, his calmness unshaken. Then let them in, he said. Transparency is the only way forward. By the time they stepped into the hallway, the school had transformed. Students lined both sides, their phones out, their eyes wide. The security detail formed a protective bubble around the governor, but it did little to quiet the crowd. Whispers followed Imani as she walked beside her father. That's her. She stood up to him. Her dad's the governor. For once, the whispers carried not mockery, but admiration. At the front doors, the glass revealed flashing cameras and vans parked at the curb. Reporters shouted questions the moment the governor came into view. The local story had already gone national in the span of an hour. Governor Lewis, is it true your daughter was assaulted by a school resource officer? Will there be an investigation? Do you believe race played a role in the officer's actions? The questions rained down like a storm. Lawson paled further, realizing how quickly this had spiraled out of his control. Anthony raised a hand and the crowd quieted. He didn't speak as a politician. He spoke as a father. This morning, my daughter, Imani Lewis, was humiliated by an officer sworn to protect students. She was grabbed, her belongings thrown to the ground, and she was addressed with language that no child should ever hear in a place of learning. This is not discipline. This is abuse of authority. The reporters surged forward. Cameras flashed. Students cheered softly from behind. Anthony's voice grew stronger. Let me be clear. I am not here for political points. I am here because my daughter is not the first student to endure this treatment, and unless we take action, she won't be the last. We will hold those responsible accountable, and we will change the culture that allowed this to happen. Behind him, Collins shifted uncomfortably, his scowl deepening. The crowd noticed. Phones turned on him, recording every twitch, every bead of sweat. One reporter shouted, "Governor, do you intend to remove Officer Collins from this school?" Anthony didn't flinch. His conduct today has disqualified him from ever setting foot in a classroom again. Whether he wears a badge tomorrow is not for me to decide, but I will ensure he never again has the power to humiliate children. The crowd erupted, students clapping, reporters shouting more questions, Lawson shrinking beside him. Imani stood quietly, her chin lifted, her expression calm. She didn't need to speak. Her silence carried more weight than any words could. Back in the office, chaos brewed. Mr. Charles Whitaker, the school board representative, fumbled with his phone, already fielding calls from state officials demanding answers. "This is out of control," he muttered. "We're going to be on every news channel tonight." Lawson paced, wringing his hands. "We should have handled this differently. We should have stopped it before it reached this point." Collins stood rigid, his face flushed with anger. "I did my job. I don't care who her father is. These kids need to learn respect." Whitaker glared at him. "Respect is earned, Officer Collins, and from where I'm standing, you've lost it." Outside, the press conference ended, but the governor wasn't finished. He turned back toward the crowd of students gathered in the hallway. His voice carried, steady but firm. "You all deserve a school where your safety doesn't come at the cost of your dignity. I promise you this, change begins today." The students erupted in applause. For once, the power dynamics had shifted. The authority figure who abused his power stood silent, while the student he tried to humiliate was lifted higher than ever. And though Collins clenched his fists in rage, he couldn't escape the truth. His downfall had already begun. The press outside Jefferson High eventually began to thin, but the energy inside the school only grew sharper. For the students, this wasn't just another ordinary day anymore. It was history in the making, and they knew it. In the cafeteria, kids crowded around phones, replaying clips of the confrontation between Imani Lewis and Officer Brad Collins. Some watched the moment her books hit the floor. Others passed around the governor's speech like it was a declaration of war. The story spread faster than any teacher could stop it. "She didn't even raise her voice," one sophomore whispered, shaking his head with admiration. "She just stood there, calm. Like she knew she was right, another added. And now the governor's here? Man, Collins is finished. The cafeteria buzzed with a strange mix of pride and disbelief. For once, students who had felt overlooked or dismissed saw someone just like them stand up and refuse to break. Imani's quiet defiance had become a symbol. Meanwhile, in the principal's office, tension hung so heavy it was suffocating. Mr. Charles Whitaker, the school board representative, slammed his phone shut after yet another heated call. We don't have time for damage control. The governor's statements are already on 3 major news channels. We need to act now. Principal Richard Lawson looked defeated, his shoulders sagging as though years of carefully maintained order were slipping away. What do you suggest? Whitaker's gaze swung to Officer Collins, who stood with his arms crossed, his jaw locked in stubborn defiance. You're suspended, effective immediately. Collins's eyes widened. Suspended? You can't do that without due process. Whitaker's voice hardened. Due process will come, but as of this moment, you're relieved of duty at Jefferson High. Leave your badge at the desk and exit the building. Collins's face turned red, his fists clenching at his sides. You're all caving to politics. That girl disrespected me in front of everyone, and now because her father's the governor, I'm the one being punished? Anthony Lewis, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. His voice was steady, calm, and impossible to ignore. You're being punished because you abused your authority. The fact that my daughter exposed it only sped up what was already inevitable. Collins glared at him, but the fight in his eyes was beginning to fade. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached for the badge pinned to his chest. He yanked it free and dropped it onto Lawson's desk with a sharp metallic clink. You haven't heard the last of this, he muttered, and with that he stormed out, his footsteps echoing down the hall. News of his suspension spread through the student body like wildfire. Cheers erupted in classrooms when the announcement circulated. For students who had lived under Collins's heavy-handed rules, the moment felt like justice. In the library, a group of students huddled together, whispering about starting a petition. We should push for him to be banned from all schools, not just ours, one said. Yeah, another agreed. If he did this to Imani, who knows how many others he's treated like that. For the first time in years, Jefferson High felt united not in fear, but in solidarity. Later that afternoon, the school board convened an emergency meeting. Cameras lined the back of the room, capturing every word. Parents packed the seats, their faces filled with a mix of outrage and curiosity. Whitaker opened the meeting with a grim tone. We are here to address an incident that has shaken our community. This morning, a student was humiliated by an officer in this school. That student's father, Governor Anthony Lewis, has made it clear this will not be ignored. Neither will we. A parent stood from the audience, her voice trembling with anger. My son told me he's seen Collins grab kids before. He's just never done it in front of so many people. You're only paying attention now because it happened to the governor's daughter. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Whitaker didn't deny it. You're right. But today is the moment we draw a line. Officer Collins has been suspended pending a full investigation, and we will be reviewing every complaint that has come through this school in the past 3 years. The room erupted in applause. Back at home that evening, Imani sat at the dining table, her homework spread out before her. Despite the chaos of the day, she moved through her assignments with quiet determination. Her father watched her from across the room, a mix of pride and sorrow in his eyes. You carried yourself with strength today, he said softly, stronger than many adults I've seen. Imani looked up, her expression calm. I just didn't want him to win. Anthony leaned forward, his voice low. You did more than that. You showed everyone what dignity looks like when it's tested, and now this fight isn't just yours. It belongs to every student who's ever felt silenced. Imani nodded, but she didn't smile. She knew the weight of what had begun today. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, Jefferson High buzzed again. This time, it wasn't with whispers of humiliation, but with something else. Respect. Students approached Imani in the hallway, offering nods, quiet thank yous, even pats on the shoulder. "You showed him," one boy muttered as he passed. "About time somebody stood up to him," another added. Imani accepted their words with grace, never letting it inflate her. She hadn't set out to be a symbol, but the role had found her. And outside the school, more cameras waited, more questions swirled, and more pressure mounted. Because while Collins had been removed from the building, the fight for accountability had only just begun, and the governor had no intention of letting it fade quietly. The following morning, Jefferson High was no longer just a school. It was a spotlight. News vans lined the street outside the campus, their satellite dishes aimed toward the sky. Reporters stood in clusters near the front gate, microphones in hand, while photographers jostled for the best shot. Helicopters circled overhead, the steady thrum of their blades a reminder that this story had leapt far beyond the boundaries of one high school. Inside, the atmosphere felt electric. Students whispered as they hurried through the halls, half in awe, half in disbelief. Many had never seen their school mentioned on local news, let alone national broadcasts. "CNN was talking about it this morning," one student whispered to another. "My mom said it's on Twitter, trending in 3 states, a girl added, wide-eyed. And at the center of it all was Imani Lewis. When she entered the building, phones immediately lifted, capturing her every move. Some students approached cautiously, thanking her for what she had done. Others simply stared, unsure how to treat the classmate who had suddenly become a symbol of defiance. Imani walked with the same quiet composure she always carried, her books tucked under her arm. But beneath her calm surface, the weight pressed heavier. She had not asked for this. She had not wanted the world's eyes on her. Yet now every step she took seemed magnified. In the faculty lounge, teachers spoke in hushed tones over lukewarm coffee. "They'll never be able to bring Collins back after this," one muttered. "Good riddance," another said. "I saw the way he treated kids, always quick to intimidate, especially the black students." Ms. Latoya Green listened quietly, her jaw set. She had already emailed the governor's office, volunteering to testify if needed. She didn't care about backlash. She cared about truth. Meanwhile, Officer Brad Collins sat in his small suburban home, watching the news coverage with fury. His suspension had been announced publicly, and his name was plastered across every channel. Headlines scrolled beneath anchors' voices. "Governor's daughter humiliated by school officer." "Community demands accountability after Jefferson High incident." His phone buzzed constantly, calls from reporters, texts from colleagues, messages from people he thought were friends but who now kept their distance. Even the police union released a statement calling his behavior troubling and subject to further review. Collins slammed his fist against the arm of his chair. "All because of her," he muttered. "One kid, one spoiled kid with a powerful father." But even as he spoke, deep down, he knew it wasn't just about one kid. It was about years of unchecked behavior finally catching up to him. At the governor's mansion, Anthony Lewis prepared for the storm ahead. He stood at the podium in his office, flanked by advisors and aides. Cameras were already being set up for a scheduled press briefing. "This can't just be about Imani," one aide cautioned. "If you make it personal, they'll accuse you of using your office to settle a private score." Anthony shook his head. "This isn't personal, it's systemic. What happened to my daughter is a symptom of something bigger, something too many families have faced without anyone listening." His aides exchanged glances. They knew he was right, and they also knew that by leaning into this moment, he was about to ignite a political firestorm. When the cameras went live, Anthony spoke with the same measured authority he had carried at the school. No child should ever walk into a classroom and wonder whether the person assigned to protect them will instead strip them of their dignity. What happened at Jefferson High is unacceptable, but it is not unique. Too many parents have stories just like this, stories that rarely make the news because they don't involve a governor's daughter. That ends now. Reporters scribbled furiously. The story was no longer about one officer and one student. It was about a statewide reckoning. Back at Jefferson High, the shift was palpable. Students began organizing, passing around flyers for a rally in support of Imani and calling for permanent changes to how officers operated in schools. In the gymnasium, a group gathered after classes to plan. "This isn't just about her," Tyrone Jackson said, his voice steady. "It's about all of us. How many times have we been stopped in the hallway for no reason? How many times were we treated like suspects instead of students?" Danielle Moore nodded, her eyes flashing with determination. "We need to show them we're not backing down. Tomorrow we walk out. Every single one of us." The students murmured their agreement. A walkout. It was bold, risky, but it carried the same spirit that had electrified the school since the incident. Word spread quickly. By nightfall, hundreds of students had pledged to join. That evening, Imani sat at her desk, staring at the growing stack of letters and emails that had been sent to her father's office. Parents she had never met were thanking her for standing strong. Students from other schools were reaching out with their own stories of humiliation. She read one message aloud to her father. "My son was grabbed by a school officer last year. We complained, but nothing was done. Watching Imani today gave him hope." Anthony listened quietly, pride flickering in his eyes, but also concern. He knew the burden this placed on his daughter's shoulders. Imani set the letter down and looked at him. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I just wanted to go to class." Anthony placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes history doesn't wait for permission. Sometimes it finds you. And when it does, all you can do is stand tall. And you did." Imani nodded, though the weight still pressed heavy. She wasn't sure she wanted to be anyone's symbol, but deep down, she knew she couldn't turn back now. The next morning, Jefferson High erupted. At precisely 10 a.m., students poured out of classrooms, streaming into the courtyard in a sea of voices. Signs lifted into the air, "Respect us," "Dignity for students," "No more Collins." Teachers stood at the doors, some bewildered, others quietly supportive. Ms. Green stood among them, pride shining in her eyes. At the center of the crowd, Imani found herself lifted by chants. She hadn't started but couldn't silence. "Imani! Imani! Imani!" The sound was deafening, overwhelming. She wanted to shrink back, but instead she lifted her head, her quiet strength carrying her forward once more. Inside, Principal Lawson watched from his office window, his face pale. He knew there was no controlling this anymore. The tide had shifted. The students had found their voice, and with the governor backing them, nothing would stop it. The courtyard of Jefferson High echoed with chants. Long after the morning bell faded, hundreds of students stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising in unison. "Respect us, respect us, no more Collins, no more Collins." Teachers tried to keep order, but the scale was overwhelming. Even those who wanted the protest to end couldn't help but marvel at the sight. For once, the student body wasn't fractured by cliques, grade levels, or rivalries. They were united by one demand: dignity. From the edge of the crowd, Imani Lewis stood quietly, her face composed even as chants of her name broke out again. She hadn't asked to lead this. She hadn't written the signs or organized the rally, but when students looked at her, they saw someone who had stood unshaken in the face of humiliation, and that image was more powerful than any speech. Ms. Latoya Green moved closer, her voice low. "Imani, you don't have to carry all this. You didn't start it, and you're not responsible for every word they chant." Imani looked at her teacher, her calm eyes betraying only a flicker of unease. I know, but if I walk away, they'll think I'm afraid, and I won't give him that. Green nodded, pride welled in her chest. The girl standing before her wasn't just a student anymore, she was a symbol of resilience. Across town, Officer Brad Collins watched footage of the walkout from his living room, his television blaring news anchors dissecting every second, his name scrolled across the bottom of the screen like a scarlet letter. Students at Jefferson High staged a walkout today, calling for accountability after Officer Collins allegedly humiliated the governor's daughter in front of her peers. Collins's face twisted with anger. He slammed his remote onto the couch. Allegedly, he spat. They've already convicted me. He snatched his phone and opened social media. His inbox was flooded with insults, threats, and calls for him to be fired. But among them were messages from supporters' small groups insisting he had done nothing wrong, that kids needed tough love, that the governor was using his office to bully an officer. Fueled by bitterness, Collins recorded a video. Sitting stiffly in his uniform, he stared into the camera. "I did my job," he declared. "That's all. One privileged girl decided she didn't like the rules, and because her father is the governor, my career is being destroyed. I will not apologize for enforcing discipline." He hit upload. Within minutes, the video spread like wildfire. Supporters cheered his defiance, but critics tore it apart. Clips of him saying "privileged girl" trended alongside reminders of his "you people" remark. The divide sharpened. Collins had hoped to save his reputation, but instead, he poured gasoline on the fire. At the state capitol, Governor Anthony Lewis watched the same footage, his expression unreadable. Around him, advisors debated strategy. "Collins is doubling down," one said. "If we don't respond, it'll look like we're avoiding him. If we do, we risk making him a martyr to his supporters." Anthony raised a hand, silencing the room. "We don't need to attack him. His own words condemn him. Our job is to make sure this moment isn't wasted." He leaned forward, his voice steady. "Draft a bill, a statewide review of how officers are assigned to schools, mandatory training in de-escalation and cultural sensitivity, and clear accountability measures when students are mistreated." An aide frowned. "That'll provoke backlash from unions." Anthony's eyes hardened. "Then let them push back. If they want to defend humiliation over protection, let them try. The people are watching now." The room fell silent. Everyone knew it was true. Back at Jefferson High, the walkout stretched into the afternoon. Students carried handmade posters with bold letters, "Dignity Matters." "We're students, not suspects." Reporters circled the crowd, their cameras capturing every chant, every sign. Parents arrived too, some holding their children close, others joining the chants themselves. What began as a single humiliation had transformed into a community uprising. Principal Richard Lawson stood at his office window, his face pale. He knew his career was hanging by a thread. He had chosen silence when Collins humiliated Imani, and that silence now branded him complicit. Inside the school board building across town, Mr. Charles Whitaker fielded call after call. "We need a plan," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "The governor's reforms are coming whether we like it or not. We either work with him or get steamrolled." That evening, Imani sat at her desk, scrolling through her phone. Her face appeared on every major news site. Clips of her standing tall while Collins barked at her had gone viral, racking up millions of views. She read comments from strangers across the country. "Proud of this young woman. She handled it better than most adults would. Protect Imani Lewis at all costs." But alongside the praise came something else: hate. Anonymous users calling her entitled, accusing her of exaggerating, insisting Collins had done nothing wrong. Her chest tightened. She set the phone down, staring at the ceiling. She hadn't asked for this spotlight. She just wanted to be a student. Her father knocked softly before stepping into her room. "Rough day?" Imani nodded. "I didn't mean for all this to happen." Anthony sat beside her, his voice gentle. "You didn't choose it. But you didn't back down either. That's why people are listening. You showed them what quiet strength looks like." Imani leaned against him, the burden momentarily lighter. "I just don't want to be the reason people fight." Anthony's voice firmed, though still soft. "You're not the reason. You're the reminder. This fight existed long before today. You just gave it a face they can't ignore." By the next morning, the walkout had spread. Schools across the district reported similar protests. Students inspired by Jefferson High taking to courtyards with signs of their own. Headlines shifted. Movement sparked by governor's daughter sweeps across state. Collins's defenders grew louder, but so did his critics. The divide sharpened, and the nation's eyes turned squarely on Jefferson High. And in the center of it all, Imani Lewis walked quietly to class, her head high, her steps steady. She hadn't sought the role, but now, whether she wanted it or not, she was the symbol of a movement. And the movement was only growing stronger. By the end of the week, Jefferson High was no longer the epicenter of a single controversy. It was the spark of something much larger. Across the state, students from dozens of schools walked out of class in solidarity with Imani Lewis. Videos flooded social media, teenagers holding handmade posters, chanting in unison, sharing stories of their own humiliations at the hands of school officers. What began as one girl's humiliation had transformed into a statewide reckoning. News anchors framed it as the Lewis movement, though Imani herself hated the label. She hadn't asked to lead anything, but the world seemed determined to make her the face of it all. At Jefferson High, Principal Richard Lawson sat hunched at his desk, staring at the growing stack of letters demanding his resignation. Parents accused him of cowardice, of standing silently while injustice unfolded in his hallways. Each new email was another nail in the coffin of his reputation. He knew the truth. His silence had been complicity, and now there was no escaping it. Meanwhile, Officer Brad Collins found himself under investigation. The police department's Internal Affairs Division opened a formal inquiry, reviewing witness statements and hours of video footage from students' phones. Each clip told the same story: Collins towering over a teenage girl, jerking her backpack, dismissing her calmly stated defense with hostility. For years, complaints against him had been quietly shelved, filed away without consequence. But now every past grievance resurfaced. Former students stepped forward, recounting moments when Collins had humiliated them for minor infractions. Parents testified about intimidation that was never addressed. What had once been whispers became evidence. Collins sat in his living room, watching it unfold on television. His face burned as he saw old students describing his behavior with anger and pain. "They're all lying," he muttered to himself. But the words rang hollow even in his own ears. Back at the state capitol, Governor Anthony Lewis moved swiftly. He convened meetings with lawmakers, drafting a reform package that would change how officers operated in schools. "This isn't about one officer," he said firmly to the committee. "This is about a system that allowed someone like him to hold unchecked power for years. We need mandatory training, accountability boards with parent representation, and an independent hotline for student complaints. Children deserve protection, not persecution." Lawmakers debated fiercely, but the governor's resolve was unshakable. He knew the nation's eyes were on him. More importantly, he knew his daughter's eyes were on him. He refused to let her down. For Imani, the sudden attention felt overwhelming. In the hallways, students greeted her with respect, even admiration, but she also heard the whispers, the ones that cut deeper. She only got attention because her dad's the governor. She didn't do anything everyone else is, making her into a hero. At home, she scrolled through her phone late into the night, reading articles dissecting her every move. Commentators debated her expression during the walkout, her silence during her father's speech, even the way she carried her books. It felt as though she no longer belonged to herself. She belonged to the public. Sitting on her bed, she whispered to herself, "I just wanted to go to class." Her father knocked gently before entering. "Can't sleep?" Imani shook her head. "I don't know if I can do this. Everyone's watching me like I'm supposed to be something bigger than I am." Anthony sat beside her, his voice calm but steady. "You don't have to be anything but yourself. That's what makes people listen. You didn't shout, you didn't fight, you stood your ground. That's all you ever need to do." Imani exhaled slowly. "But what if I fail them?" Anthony placed a hand over hers. "You didn't choose this moment, Imani, but you've already shown more strength than most people ever will. Trust that, and trust yourself." The next day, students staged a massive rally on the steps of the Capitol building. Thousands gathered, their voices echoing through the city streets. Banners read, "Protect students, not pride." Imani stood up, "So do we." Imani stood quietly among them, her presence enough to electrify the crowd. Reporters swarmed, their cameras capturing the image of a 16-year-old girl standing tall beside her father as chants of "Justice now" filled the air. Collins, watching from home, slammed his remote to the floor. His bitterness deepened, but even he could see the truth. His downfall was no longer about one mistake. It was about everything he represented. That evening, the governor addressed the crowd from the Capitol steps. His voice carried with authority, but it was the sight of Imani standing beside him that silenced the thousands gathered. "Today is not about politics," he declared. "It's about children. It's about the promise that when you walk into a classroom, you will be treated with respect." My daughter's dignity was stripped from her in front of her peers, but she stood tall. And because she stood tall, so will we. The crowd erupted. The chant rose again. "Imani, Imani, Imani." Imani closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. She hadn't wanted this, but now she realized maybe she needed to embrace it, not for herself, but for everyone who had ever been humiliated and silenced. And in that moment, she understood. She wasn't just a girl trying to get to class anymore. She was the voice of something larger. The hearing room buzzed with quiet tension. Rows of parents, teachers, and reporters filled the seats, their eyes fixed on the long table at the front where Officer Brad Collins sat stiffly in uniform. Across from him, the members of the review board prepared to begin proceedings. Cameras lined the walls, broadcasting the event live across the state. Collins's attorney whispered in his ear, urging him to stay calm. But Collins's jaw tightened as murmurs rippled through the room. He hated the way they looked at him, not as a protector, but as the accused. The board chair cleared her throat. "We are here to investigate allegations of misconduct by Officer Brad Collins, who is accused of physically intimidating and verbally degrading student Imani Lewis at Jefferson High School. We will review testimony and evidence before making a recommendation." One by one, witnesses spoke. Students described the moment Collins yanked Imani's backpack, the books scattering across the hallway. Teachers testified to his words, "You people always think you're owed something." Videos played on the big screen, the sound of gasps audible even among those who had already seen them. Collins shifted in his seat, his face reddening. When his turn came, his voice was defiant. "I acted within my authority. Students today don't respect rules. If we let them get away with defiance, we lose control. I was doing my job." The board chair leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Officer Collins, discipline is not humiliation. Protection is not intimidation. This is not the first complaint against you, but it will be the last we ignore." The gavel struck. Gasps filled the room. Collins had been found in violation of department policy. The board recommended his immediate removal from school duty and referred his case for disciplinary review within the police department. Collins stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. This is a witch hunt, all because of one girl and her father's position. But his words fell flat. No one cheered. No one defended him. The once feared officer was now just a man whose authority had collapsed under the weight of his own actions. At the state capitol, Governor Anthony Lewis addressed lawmakers. The reform package he proposed, mandatory training, independent oversight, clear reporting channels, had sparked heated debates. Some claimed it was an overreach. Others warned it would strain budgets. But parents packed the hearing room, their voices louder than any lobbyist. One mother stood and said, "My son deserves to go to school without being treated like a suspect. If the governor's daughter hadn't been humiliated, would you be listening? How many more children need to suffer before you act?" The legislators shifted uncomfortably. It was clear public opinion had turned. The reforms were no longer optional. They were inevitable. For Imani Lewis, the whirlwind felt surreal. She had spent her evenings quietly doing homework, her days navigating hallways filled with stares and whispers. But everywhere she turned, her name carried weight. One morning her father sat her down. "Imani," he said gently, "there's a rally downtown this weekend. Parents and students from across the state are coming. They want you to speak." Imani froze. "Me?" Anthony nodded. "They see you as the face of this movement. You don't have to do it. But if you're ready, they want to hear your voice." Imani's chest tightened. She had stood calmly against humiliation, but speaking to thousands. That was different. Yet as she looked into her father's eyes, she remembered the weight of all those messages from students. She had never met kids who said she had given them hope. She nodded slowly. "I'll do it." The rally drew a crowd larger than anyone expected. Thousands filled the park, their voices echoing with chants for change. Signs waved high above the sea of people. Dignity for students. Accountability now. Imani stood tall, so do we. When Imani stepped onto the stage, the noise swelled to a roar. She gripped the podium, her heart hammering in her chest. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. Her father stood a few feet behind her, his presence steady, but he didn't speak. This was her moment. Imani drew a deep breath. "I didn't ask for any of this," she began, her voice clear but quiet. The crowd leaned in, listening. "I just wanted to go to class. But when I was stopped in the hallway, when my books were knocked to the floor, when I was told, 'You people always think you're owed something,' I knew it wasn't just about me. It was about every student who's ever been made to feel small." The crowd erupted in cheers, but she raised her hand, continuing, "I'm not special because my father is the governor. I'm just like every other kid who deserves respect. And if I can stand up, so can you. So can all of us." Her words rippled through the crowd, her quiet strength magnified by the thousands listening. For too long, students have been treated like suspects instead of scholars. That ends now. We deserve schools where safety doesn't come at the cost of dignity. And together, we can make sure no one else has to go through what I did. The applause shook the ground. Chants of her name rolled through the park, not as flattery but as solidarity. Anthony Lewis stood silently, pride welling in his chest. His daughter had found her voice not because he was governor, but because she was Imani. And in that moment, the movement no longer belonged to politics. It belonged to the people. Back at his home, Collins watched the speech on television. His hands trembled with rage, but his face told the truth. Fear had replaced arrogance. For the first time, he realized he was not just fighting the governor, he was fighting an entire state. The vote came on a Thursday afternoon. The state legislature chamber was filled to the brim, lawmakers seated at their desks. Reporters crowded in the press gallery, parents and students lining the balcony. Cameras rolled as the tally lit up on the massive board above the chamber floor. House Bill 742, the Speaker announced, an act establishing accountability and training requirements for school resource officers, has passed with bipartisan support. The chamber erupted in applause. Some lawmakers shook their heads in defeat, but most stood to clap. The governor's reforms were no longer proposals. They were law. In the gallery, students from Jefferson High cheered, their chants echoing through the chamber. Respect, respect, respect. For Governor Anthony Lewis, it was vindication. For Imani Lewis, it was a weight lifted. That evening, the governor signed the bill into law at a public ceremony on the Capitol steps. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the crowd cheered as Anthony raised his pen. But when it came time for remarks, he stepped aside. "This movement was never about me," he said into the microphone. "It began because of my daughter, and it continues because of every student who deserves dignity. Tonight, she will have the last word." He gestured toward Imani. The crowd erupted as she stepped forward, the same quiet composure in her eyes that had carried her through every moment since that morning in the hallway. "I didn't choose to be here," she began, her voice steady, "but I did choose not to back down. When I was humiliated, I stood tall because I knew I wasn't just standing for myself. I was standing for everyone who has ever been treated like they don't belong." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Students, parents, teachers, lawmakers. Today proves that one moment can change everything, but it only changes because people come together, because students walk out, because parents demand answers, because lawmakers finally listen. That's the power of us. The crowd roared. Her words carried not the anger of a victim, but the strength of someone who had turned pain into purpose. Across town, Brad Collins sat alone in his kitchen, the television muted. His suspension had turned permanent. His badge was gone. The internal review had stripped him of his position, citing a pattern of misconduct. Appeals had been filed, but he knew the truth. His career was finished. On the screen, he saw Imani's face, calm, dignified, powerful. The girl he had tried to humiliate now stood taller than ever, her name forever tied to reforms that erased his authority. For the first time, Collins felt not just anger, but emptiness. He had tried to break her, and instead, he had broken himself. Back at Jefferson High, the atmosphere had shifted. The once feared presence of Collins no longer loomed. Students walked the halls with a new sense of confidence. Teachers spoke openly about fairness and respect. The scars of the incident lingered, but they had given rise to something greater. Imani returned to her routine honors classes, debate club, afternoons volunteering at the community center. To many, she was a symbol, but to her friends, she was still just Imani, the girl who studied late into the night and laughed quietly at inside jokes. One afternoon, Tyrone Jackson caught up with her in the library. "You realize you changed everything, right?" he said, shaking his head in amazement. Imani smiled faintly. "I didn't change everything. We did." At home, Anthony watched his daughter as she worked on a school essay, the lamplight reflecting off her focused eyes. Pride filled him, but so did relief. She had carried a weight far beyond her years, and she had carried it with grace. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "Your mother would be so proud." Imani looked up and met his gaze. "Yeah, I hope so. I just want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." Anthony nodded. "That's exactly what you've done." Weeks later, the story faded from headlines, replaced by new controversies, new crises. But the impact remained. The reforms stayed in place. Students across the state felt a little safer, a little more respected, and Jefferson High became a symbol of what happens when dignity is defended. For Imani, life returned to something resembling normal. She still faced whispers in the hall, the occasional stranger asking for a photo, but she carried it lightly. She knew the story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had found their voice because of it. And when she walked into class one morning, her books tucked neatly under her arm, no one dared to stop her.